G'day from Australia. My name's Ashley Davis. Welcome back to my coding live stream. You are watching me build a full stack application, which is the example application for my new book, Rapid Full Stack Development. Please feel free to reach out on Twitter. You can see my handle on the screen. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm broadcasting. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm doing these live streams to support my book, Rapid Full Stack Development. Please check it out at rapidfullstackdevelopment.com. You can subscribe for updates if you want to get news on how the book is going. Today we're continuing to build the backend for the Photosphere application. If you've missed out on the previous live streams, you can find them on my YouTube channel, which is Code Capers. Go to playlists, look up the playlist, Rapid Full Stack Development. You'll find the previous two videos there, and new videos that I add in the future will appear here as well. You can find the code that I'm writing for this live stream on GitHub, and I'm publishing it as I go. So at the end of each live stream, you can actually kind of look at the code and see what I've done in that session. So look up the GitHub organization, Rapid Full Stack Development. The code I'm working on today is the Photosphere monolithic backend live stream. Some instructions here for how to get going with it yourself. Click on the code button, copy the code here, probably HTTPS, copy the link to the repo, and you can get this code for yourself using git clone. Today I'm picking up directly where I left off in the previous session. So if you remember, we were working on uploading an asset. We got the simple version of that done. Today what I want to do is get the HTTP request handler in for retrieving an asset. And then we're going to go back and we're going to revise each of these to use a database. So we're going to use a database to store the information about the assets that we're uploading. So first things first, I'm just going to test this just to make sure it's working. I'll just make sure there's no outstanding work locally. So there's no outstanding things to be committed or pushed. I'm going to start this up in development mode with live reload enabled. We have a web server that is listening locally on port 3000. I don't have to use a web browser to test it because I am using VS Code REST client, which I showed you how to set up in the last session. So I can send a request from this script here. So I can test my REST API directly from Visual Studio Code. And I can see here that I've got a status OK 200 for this request to upload an asset. And I do have an asset that has been uploaded into the backend's upload directory here. What I want to do now is add a REST API to be able to retrieve this asset that we've uploaded. So I'm going to start by writing a test script to make sure that we can retrieve an asset. So this is going to be a HTTP GET request on localhost 3000, which is where we are hosting our development web server. And I'm going to get an asset. But this time I need to give it some parameters because I need to tell it which asset to get. And I'm going to get it actually by file name. So we don't actually have any IDs yet for these. We do need to have database IDs, but we don't have a database yet. And so I'm literally just referencing assets by their file name, by their local file name when it was uploaded. Now this is all I need for this. If I click on send request now, I'm going to get a 404 not found because I haven't written the code for this route handler yet. Let's go ahead and do that. So this time around, previously I'd written a post request handler. This time around I'm writing a get request handler. URL or the route is the same, so the asset route, but it's just a different kind of request on the same route. So I've got a basic empty request handler there. I could check that this works. I could check that this works just like that. But I'm going to get a status code 200 back. So we've got a status code 200, but we don't have what we want yet. We're not actually returning anything. It's just saying okay. But what I want to see here is I actually want to see the asset being returned, the asset that I've uploaded, which is this placeholder asset, by the way. So the first thing I want to do here is I want to pull the file name out of the request parameters. And I'm just going to console log that. And we'll just check that we're getting through the data that we expect from our test. I'm just going to run this request again. And now if I go back to my terminal, we'll see undefined. So what have I done wrong here? I expected this to be placeholder.png, the name of the file that we're trying to get. Sometimes my brain just isn't wired correctly, especially at this time of the morning. Let's try that. So I just sent the request. I'm going back to the terminal. And you can see here that we've got placeholder printed out in the console. So we know that we're getting through the thing that we expect. We're making very small, deliberate steps here. Not trying to code too much at once, just trying to code a little bit at a time. Now I need to formulate a local path for the asset that I'm going to get. So this is very similar. In fact, I can just reuse this code here. So the code that I wrote yesterday for composing the local file name in the backend, I'm just going to copy that. That's exactly what I want. Now I could console log this as well just to test it. I'm pretty sure that's going to be correct. But if I wanted to absolutely be sure that every line of code I was writing was correct, I could console log that just to see, because you'd be surprised how often you get it wrong. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to see if I can stream that file from the file system and return it. That'll be the easiest way to do this if that works. So I'm going to open a file read stream. Create read stream is the one I want. I'm streaming that local file. And I mean, this sort of stuff is really simple with Express because you can literally just pipe your file stream to the response object. This should be all I need to do to get something working. It's probably not going to be exactly work the way we want. But now what I'm hoping to see is when I run this request, I'm hoping to get a status code 200, and I'm hoping to kind of get the asset data back as well. Let's have a look at what that looks like. I'm sending the request. Oh yeah, so I'm getting some data back here, but it's all a complete mess. And I'll show you how to fix that. Well, so the problem here is that we haven't kind of told the response what the content type is that's coming back. So that's something that I'm missing here, and I'm going to have to write that into the response. Where am I going to do that? I'll do it just here. So into the response, I'm going to write the head. It's going to be status code 200. I'm going to write a content type. I'm just going to hard code this for the moment. So it's not always going to be a PNG file. So I know that I've got a loose end. I know I'm creating a loose end here that I'll have to look at later. I should track that, really. I should track that in my to-do list, but I'll just keep moving on. So I'm telling it the response that it's getting a PNG image, and I'll run this request again. And now you can see the image comes back in the response. So that's a great success there. Now we can upload an image and we can actually get it. The happy path through the code works. You know, we should test our error conditions. And we should cater for those and return a proper HTTP response code, depending on what the error is. But just in the interest of time, I'm going to move forward in the live stream, and I'll add better error handling to this a little bit later. Note that we're taking a bit of a liberty here by hard coding the content type. This is one of the reasons why we want to have a database behind this, because you'll remember yesterday, in yesterday's session, when we're having the asset uploaded here in the post request, that we're recording the content type, but we're not storing it in. We don't actually have anywhere to save it. So we want to save this in the database, and then what we want to do down here is we want to be able to retrieve it. Now, before we move forward, though, I am going to commit this because I do like, once I have working code, code that I'm happy with, I do like to commit it so that we preserve the changes. So you can see here I've got 2 files changed. I'm using the fork UI here for Git. So my index.js, where I've added my request handler, that's all new code. It's simple, there's no error handling, but I think it's worth committing at this point. before I break it. So the reason I'm committing each working change that I get is just in case I do break something in the future, I can easily back out of that problem. I might even show you that if I get time. So this is the change to my request script or my HTTP request script using VS Code REST client. I've added a little kind of entry here to retrieve an asset, and that's what we used to test our new REST API that was in index.js. Commit that. We'll just say added a simple HTTP GET route handler to retrieve previously uploaded asset. So let's get that away. So if you are following along with the live stream, you can get that code right now as I'm pushing it. I'm restarting my development server here. Before we move on, I'm just going to do a quick refactor to my my HTTP request script here. Because you'll see I'm going to start getting some more API calls here, and I'm reusing this kind of this URL here. And what happens if I want to kind of change the port, or if I want to kind of test this on a production server or something like that? I basically want to be able to pull this out to a variable, which is something really cool you can do with VS Code REST client. I normally call this base URL. And then we can add our base URL into each request instead of just hard coding it. So I'm just going to test that this still works. Got to test every change that you make to your code, even if it's just test code. I'll commit that. So it's sharing, I refactored the test script to share the base URL between requests. So I'm going to be using a Mongodb database to back up this backend and store the data that we've got. I'm going to use a little kind of project that I created called Mongo on NPM. This is a tool that you can install in your project that will give you an instant development database. And it supports database fixtures as well, although I'm not sure if we'll get time to look at those today. So I'm stopping this again because I'm going to install Mongo now. So I'm installing Mongo as a dev dependency. This is only something that I want to support my development activities. It's not something that I want to use in production. If you wanted to run Mongo just to try it out, you just run it using npx like that. npx Mongo. So this is going to give us just an instant database that we can connect to and do stuff with. You can see here it's going to give you some information about where the database is running and how to load database fixtures. Now I'm going to kill this, Control C to kill it. The database is gone, so it's a temporary dev database. It only exists while you're running the command Mongo. Now I'm just going to install a couple of other dev dependencies that I want to have here. Concurrently and cross-env. Concurrently is a really cool tool that allows you to run multiple other tools in parallel at the same time. So this is what I'm going to use to be able to run my dev database and my backend at the same time. Actually, I think that's the wrong cross-env. I need to use cross-env with a hyphen. Sorry about that. So I'm installing concurrently and cross-env. Cross-env allows you to plug in environment variables on the command line in your script. So this is what I'm going to use. I'm going to use an environment variable to connect my backend to the dev database using an environment variable that's created through cross-env. While this is installing, I'm going to go and start to set up some scripts that I need for running the dev database. I'm in package.json now, so this is where I want to add some scripts for setting up the dev database. So I'm going to start with a start db command. And in this command, I'm going to run Mongo. I'm going to tell it which DB port to use, 7001. I'm going to tell it which REST API port to use, even though I'm not sure if I'm going to get time to use the REST API today to show you that. I will definitely be connecting to and using the database. Now I want a command to start my application with the dev DB. And I will call it start with dev DB. Pretty obvious what that means then. Now this is where I want to use that cross-env library. So I'm using it to specify my database connection string. Spell it correctly. And I'm going to set that to MongoDB localhost 7001, which is the port where I put my database. And then, just like my start dev command above, I'm going to run nodemon against index.js. Now I'm going to actually change my start dev command. So this is where in start dev, this is where I want to start the database and I want to start my backend and connect it to the dev database. So this is where I'm going to make use of concurrently. And so concurrently allows you to run two commands. So you put your commands in quotes, escaped quotes. So here is the first command. The first command is npm run start db. So I'm starting my database. And at the same time, I'm running npm run start with dev db. So I'm starting my application, connecting it to the dev database. So this is what starting in development means now. It means starting a database, instant dev database, and it means starting the application and using this environment variable to connect it to the database. So I haven't changed any of my code yet. None of my code is actually connecting to the database or making use of it. I'm just setting up a little bit of kind of infrastructure, development infrastructure here in order to, I made the same mistake that I seem to make before, is that I'm editing my package.json while I'm installing stuff, so it's out of sync now. I'm just going to have to close. So I've just copied that there. I'm just closing my package.json file. I'm going to reopen it. We should see now that I've got concurrently cross-env and Insta Mongo. I'm going to update the scripts with the ones I just created. And I'm going to test this. So I could test my new scripts individually. I could test start db and then I could test that. But I'm just going to jump straight ahead and test start:dev with the new sort of concurrently database and backend that it's running. So I'm running start dev. So this is going to operate differently to when I ran it before. You can see here it's running the concurrently command and it's doing both of these commands here concurrently. So they're both running in parallel. They're running at the same time. You can see here there's output. These zeros are output from the dev database from InstaMongo. These outputs here that are preceded with one are outputs from the app. So the app is running as it did before for 3000. You can see here the output from InstaMongo saying where the MongoDB server is running. So that is some dev infrastructure setup. That is a perfect commit. I don't need to do anything else. I just want to save this work. I want to put this work in the bank. So I'm just going to say that I've added the setup for the development database running concurrently with the backend. So that is committed. I will just quickly push that just in case there's anyone watching who kind of wants to play with that straight away. Now I'm just going to run my development server again. It's running in live reload, so whatever changes we make are going to be there. Now, so how do I get my app connected to my database? Well, the database setup is asynchronous. What I want to do here is I want to wrap this whole thing, this whole setup of the whole server in an asynchronous function so that before it all happens, I can do an asynchronous connection to the database. So I like to start with an async main function. So you can see a bit of my kind of C++ background coming out here. And then I run that in the main script, and usually I just catch errors that happen anywhere in it. So this is a promise-based catch handler. I'll just say something went wrong and do an error here where I'm just dumping out the error. So you could do something here like process exit 1, just to, you know, if anything's depending on this, on the actual exit code. Later on, you'll have told it that something went wrong when this process was run. Now, you know, this is where I want to do everything in my main function. I want to connect to my database, you know, set up my REST API, So I've got all the code already to set up the REST API. I can just move all that in here and replace that. And I'm gonna make sure that's nicely indented. So I'll just put a nice comment in here. We'll start the REST API. I want to move everything to do with the REST API just there, actually. So creating the Express app, I'll move that there. The port, which later on I want to pass in through an environment variable, I'll put there. So let's see if this works. Make sure this is working. First thing I want to do is look at my terminal. No errors in the terminal, so that's a good starting point. Now, bearing in mind that this automatically restarted when I saved those changes. Now, I just want to go back and I want to test my REST APIs again. So I'll test that I can upload an asset. Looks good. I'll test that I can retrieve that asset. Looks good. So I've just done a refactor on my code. Now, the interesting thing about refactors is that they pretty much always break code. Like, you know, I've been careful here and I'm lucky that it still works. But generally speaking, whenever you refactor code, you're going to break it, you've got to test it, you've got to fix it, right? And then I would say, once you've done that, once you've proved that it's working, that's another commit. So I like when I'm doing refactoring, I like to not do any behavior changes. So I'm not changing the way any of the features in the product. I'm not changing the way the code works in respect to the user. I'm just basically refining the code, making trying to improve the design. And in this case, I'm improving the design because I need to achieve something. I need to add the connection for the database. So refactoring should always have an important purpose and it should always be well tested. So I've refactored to support async database connection. I'm going to commit that. So I've refactored this function, or you know, my kind of main entry point in my code, so that I've got a main function. It's all still working, which is good. I'm ready to add this bit here, which is the database connection. Now, actually, I need to install a library to be able to do this. I need to install the MongoDB client library in order to be able to connect to MongoDB. So just going back to the terminal, just going to close that down. So I need to npm install MongoDB. So this gets me the MongoDB client library, the thing that allows me to connect to MongoDB from my code. I'm just going to bring in a couple of imports for what I need, connect to MongoDB. I need a name for a database that I'm actually going to use. I'm just going to call it backend. Now this could come in as an environment variable if you want to be able to configure what the name of the database is for this particular REST API. I'm going to read my database connection string from process.environment. So this is the environment variable that is coming in. So just as a reminder where that comes from, we'll go back to the package.json. In here, I've set, using crossend, I've set this environment variable to the URL for my database just before running the actual backend. So that's how that environment variable is getting in here. And this needs to be there. If this is not there, so if this is undefined, I want to throw an error. And I want to tell the user that they need to set that, because this backend needs a database, and whether it's just a locally installed MongoDB, doesn't matter. The user needs to know, the user of this backend, or whoever's monitoring this or maintaining it or in operations, needs to know that there's got to be an environment variable to set that. So I'm throwing an error straight away if that does not exist. Now I'm going to connect client to MongoDB using that database connection string. I'm just gonna, this is why I wanted this asynchronous setup, so I can use the await keyword. So this is why I'm using this async keyword on the main function here. It's so that I can use the await keyword here and have this asynchronous database connection. Now I want to pull out the database that I'm going to be using. So I've written up above there the backend database from the database server. I'm going to pull out the assets collection. And I'll just call it assets. So I'm calling it assets to be a little bit more general purpose because I want to be able to upload photos and videos, maybe other things in the future. So I'm calling it assets rather than a photos collection or a videos collection. I'm calling it the assets collection. Now I can actually check that I've connected to the database here and that I can actually retrieve something from the collection. Even though there's going to be nothing there, there's going to be nothing in the database yet, of course. But I can load some assets. This is an asynchronous operation, so I need to await the result. What am I doing? I want the assets collection, so I'm just going to copy that down. And I'm doing a find on that, and I'm finding everything, and I'm converting it to an array, and I'm just going to console log that. And I'll just put a log above it so I know what I'm looking at here. Now, by the time I get back to my terminal after I've saved this, I should see a result. I should see that console log coming up. Oh, if I'd started it. I installed MongoDB, but I didn't actually restart my dev server, so I'll do that now. It said I've got to look. There's multiple processes happening here, so I'm going to ignore all that bit. But you can see here the initial assets are an empty array, so there are no assets yet. But this proves that I've connected to the database. I've connected to the database, and I've retrieved an empty collection of records from that table, from that assets table. So that is some good progress. That shows me that that database connection is working. This is a commit. Let's just review what I've done. So I've added some code here to connect to the database and print out the initial assets. I've added a dependency on MongoDB. Pretty happy with that. So backend is now connecting to the database. So this is currently connecting to the dev database, but you could easily change and connect to a prod database just by plugging in a different database connection string. Now that I've done that, I'm just going to remove that console logging there. So now that I've got my assets collection here, I can actually go through now. I can actually go through in my upload route handler, and I can record the details of the asset that was added. And in my HTTP route handler to retrieve an asset, I can retrieve things like the content type from the database and return that to the caller of the API. Now at this point, I can also fix this issue where I'm storing the asset in the file system using the original file name. So you can see here I'm constructing the local file name from that original file name, and I'm using that to write the file. The problem with that is that it prohibits different people from uploading files, or even you just from uploading different files from different computers that have the same file name. So they're going to conflict, they're going to overwrite each other. So that's not good. But what we can do to get around that is create a database ID. So I'm going to call it asset ID. I'm newing up a new object ID from MongoDB here. Now just to show you what this looks like, I'm just going to console log it. And then we'll run my asset upload. We'll go back to the terminal to have a look at what that looks like. So you can see here, this is what that's printing out. If I wanted to actually print that as a regular string, I can do that, I think, just by adding a toString. Let's try that. We'll run this request again. Go back to the terminal, and you see the string there. So this is going to be different every time you call it. Let's just prove that. So that's a 629 something or other ending in a 0E. If I run this again, I'll get hopefully something different. Did I run that? Yeah, so this time around, it's similar at the start. You can see that it's clearly different at the end. So every time we create that ID, we will get a different unique ID that can be used to index the record in our database collection. So that's going to be so much better to use that instead of the file name. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to generate the local file name from that asset ID and not from the file name that was uploaded. What I want to be able to do now is, after I've actually streamed this file to storage, I want to be able to add a database record that references that file and records the details to it. What I want to do is I want to make this route handler be async. Now this is why, if you remember in the first session, I installed the beta version of Express 5. I did that because it supports async route handlers. So this wouldn't work on version 4 or below. The way I want to do this, it wouldn't work properly. So that's why I've got Express 5. Because what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to do all this thing in an asynchronous function and just await the completion of it. So this is the perfect opportunity to do a small refactor on the code. I'm going to use Refactor Rename. So I'm going to extract this to a function in main. I will call it stream to storage. And I'm going to make that be an asynchronous function. So I'm going to await the result of that. That's not going to work yet because I haven't done that. So I'm just going to hit F12 to jump to that. Actually, that didn't end up where I wanted it. I wanted it outside this main function. So I'm just going to move it. I'm just going to take that whole thing, move it to the end, make sure it's lined up correctly. Put a comment on it. I always like to have good comments for my functions. So by writing the comment, I'm just sort of saying what I want this to do. Now, because this is not an asynchronous or promise-based function, the way I'm using Node.js streams here, I need to make a promise manually. So I'm not going to explain too much, why this works the way it does, because it's kind of complicated. But I'm wrapping this whole operation in a promise here. I'm returning the promise, and I'm going to reject the promise when there's an error. I probably can get rid of most of that. I'm going to move that up if I can. And then I'm going to resolve the promise here when the writing is finished. So when we've finished writing the file, the promise is going to be resolved. If there was an error, the promise is going to be rejected. Now, this isn't specifically have to be dealing with a request. So this, in practice, this is going to be a HTTP request coming in that we're going to pipe to our file write stream. But I'm going to do a refactor rename on this. I'm just hitting F2 in Visual Studio Code, and I'm going to rename this to input stream. Because it doesn't, the concept of it doesn't have to be like a request. It literally is, from our point of view in this function, it is just an input stream. Let's go back up to where we were before. So now I should have my function stream to storage, and I'm awaiting that. This should still work. I need to, this code here where I'm setting my status 200, I need to move that up. I'm going to do that at the end. I'll get rid of some of that code there that I hopefully don't need now. So I've done a refactor here. This should still work, hopefully. If I run backend now, if I run my request, I'm getting an internal server error, so something's broken. Path argument must be of type string. So I'm passing an object ID, I think, path.join function. I instantly know these things because I've had these errors so many times. It might be a little bit more harder to figure that stuff out, a little bit more time reading the docs. I can get rid of that response there that I'm passing in as well. Yeah, so the problem is here, this asset ID. I think I just have to convert that to a string, pass that through. So you can see here, I'm testing my code in a very granular fashion. I'm just writing a little bit of code before I test it. I'm still getting an internal server error. There's something still wrong with this. Undefined is not a promise. Where's that coming from? Index.js line 70. Let's look that up. get into index.js and I use Control-G, I can jump straight to line 70. Oh, I forgot the new keyword. That's probably going to be it. So I figured that out, just by scanning that code. I'm trying to see what's missing. Hopefully that's all it is. Let's try running this again. Sure, I got a 200 OK and an OK back now, so I'm pretty satisfied that's working. So this is a small stepping stone, but a fairly big refactor. So this commit that I want to do now that I've tested, and I'm just checking to see if everything here is what I want it to be, how I want it to go in. This is a refactor to basically make the streaming asynchronous, so that I can support adding, doing stuff afterwards using the await keyword. How do I write that in commit message? It's a bit of a long one. Refactor so factored out the function to stream to local storage to make it easier to add to the database after the operation. So now we can actually insert into our database. So we're back in the asset upload route handler, and I'm going to await adding or inserting one item into my database collection. The ID of it is going to be the asset ID that we created. I want to store the original file name of where the user uploaded it. I'm going to store the content type that we extracted from the header. So now I'll have something in my database after I run this. I'm saving that. So at this point here, I really want to be able to test this. I really want to be able to visualize like what is actually getting added to the database. And I've got a bit of software called Robo3T that I can use to connect to the database and look into it. You can't actually get Robo3T anymore. If you Google for it, you will find here, it says here, Robo3T is now Studio 3T. So there is a newer version, but I kind of like the older version still, so I'm still using it. But it'll probably work pretty much the same as this. It'll just look a little bit different. So I'm going to connect to localhost. Where was I running my database? From memory, it was port 7000. Guess that I can connect to that. Yep. I'm just connecting using this UI to connect to my database and have a look in it. I can't zoom this, so hopefully it's not too small for people to see. There's nothing there yet, so let me just go back and actually run my request. I'm running this upload now, fingers crossed. Get a 200, yep, I do. I should have now an entry added to my database. If I do a refresh on my connection here, see that I've got a backend database now added to my database server. Under collections, I've got an assets collection. If you look there, I wish I could zoom this, but what you can see here is the thing that we've added. So that's the ID of the asset, the original file name, which is placeholder.png, and the content type, which is image/png. So we've implemented storing our asset details to our database. I've run out of time in this live stream, well and truly. I'm going to have to come back to this and continue it next week. Next week, we're going to look at, what do we do to retrieve that asset from the database and returning things, and not hard coding this content type here is one thing that I really want to fix. It's a loose end that I really want to fix in this. This value here is what I want to pull out of the database and be able to return to the client of this API. In the next session, we're also going to look at getting a list of all the assets that have been added to the database, and we might even get time to look at using some database fixtures testing. These live streams are to support my book, Rapid Full Stack Development. So in the book, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be summing up all the code and the techniques that I'm teaching you in this live stream, and make it much more succinct and hopefully easy to read and easy to take on board. Please subscribe for updates or follow me on Twitter. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back again next week. Please watch me on Twitter or Twitch for the schedule for my live streams next week. Thanks so much. Bye.